The encrypted phone on the mahogany desk vibrated for the 99th time that evening. Kwon Tae-Yul didn't lift his gaze. He simply watched the blue light bleed into the shadows of his private library, a room that smelled of old leather and the expensive tobacco he never actually smoked. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city was a grid of glowing circuits, an empire he ruled with a surgical, frozen hand. 99 notifications. Rival syndicate heads groveling for a truce. Arms dealers confirming shipments. High society women sending curated photos, hoping to become the next Mrs. Kwon. Even his father's board of directors, pushing for a merger that was really just a polite term for a political marriage. Delete. Ignore. Silence. To Tae-Yul, power wasn't in the noise. It was in the luxury of being unreachable. The door creaked, a sound that usually preceded a report of violence or a request for a life-altering decision. His lead enforcer stood in the doorway, his reflection ghost-like against the glass. "Sir, the elder is demanding an audience. He wants your signature on the Kong family alliance by dawn." Tae-Yul's jaw tightened, the intricate dragon tattoo on his neck shifting as his pulse quickened. The alliance, a prison sentence disguised as a wedding. For 8 years, since his brother's blood had stained the very floors he now walked, Tae-Yul had been a weapon for the family name. A stock option. A ghost. "Tell him the ink is dry when I say it is," Tae-Yul said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that made men tremble. The enforcer bowed and retreated, leaving Tae-Yul alone with the silence he had built like a fortress. He was 29, untouchable, and utterly hollow. Trust was a currency he couldn't afford to spend. Then, the silence didn't just break, it dissolved. It wasn't a phone alert. It was the soft, rhythmic clink of porcelain and the scent of Earl Grey tea. He turned, his icy gaze ready to strike, but froze. Amara Lisette Cole stood there, her modest gray maid's uniform a stark contrast to the cold luxury of the room. She wasn't looking at his phone or his suit. She was looking at the weariness in his eyes. "I thought you looked like you needed a moment of peace, sir," she said softly. "Not Mr. Kwon. Not chairman. Just sir." It wasn't the sir of a subordinate fearing a master. It was the sir of a woman acknowledging a man. For the first time in a decade, the 99 messages meant nothing. Tae-Yul found himself reaching not for his phone, but for the tea, his hand brushing hers. "You're late with the tray, Amara," he murmured, though he didn't pull away. "I'm exactly on time," she replied with a quiet, fearless smile. "You just finally stopped looking at your screen long enough to notice." In that second, the most dangerous man in Seoul realized he didn't want to ignore the world anymore. He just wanted to hear her say that one word again. The tea steamed between them, a pale amber swirl that seemed to be the only thing moving in the vast, stagnant luxury of the library. Kwon Tae-Yul watched her. He was a man who lived in the spaces between heartbeats, always calculating the distance between a threat and a reaction, yet Amara Lisette Cole moved within his perimeter as if the air didn't turn to ice wherever he stepped. "You're late with the tray, Amara," he had said, but his voice lacked the lethal edge that usually sent his subordinates into a spiral of apologies. Amara didn't flinch. She set the delicate teacup down with a steady hand, the porcelain clicking softly against the wood. "I'm exactly on time," she replied, her voice a warm, grounding melody against the cold hum of the city outside. "You just finally stopped looking at your screen long enough to notice." Tae-Yul leaned back, his broad shoulders stretching the fabric of his tailored black suit. The dragon tattoo on his neck seemed to coil in the dim light. "Most people in this house breathe only when I give them permission. You, however, seem to think my schedules are suggestions." Amara straightened, smoothing the front of her simple white apron. She met his gaze, intense, dark, and searching, without the slightest tremor. "In my world, Mr. Kwon, or sir, if you prefer, time isn't measured in power plays or board meetings. It's measured in the minutes between the bus arriving and the shift starting. It's measured in the time it takes for my mother's medication to kick in so she can sleep without pain. I don't have the energy to be afraid of a man just because he owns the skyline." Tae-Yul felt a strange, jarring sensation in his chest. It was the friction of two worlds rubbing together. They call me the monster of Seoul, he murmured, testing the weight of the title on her. They say I have no pulse, only a ledger of debts and deaths. I've seen monsters, Amara said softly, her eyes softening with a quiet, lived-in strength. They aren't always men in expensive suits with tattoos. Sometimes they are the bills that don't get paid or the doctors who look through you because you don't have the right insurance. You're just a man who has forgotten how to be lonely because he's too busy being important. The silence that followed was different from the one Tae-Yul usually inhabited. It wasn't the silence of fear or the silence of a tomb. It was a fragile, breathing peace. He looked at the tea, then back at her. Her presence was disarming. She didn't want his money, and she didn't want his blood. She simply stood there, a beacon of sincerity in a life built on shadows. My mother used to say that the loudest rooms are usually the emptiest, she continued, moving to adjust a stack of books he had left in disarray. You have 99 messages telling you how great or how dangerous you are, but not one of them asks if you're actually hungry, or if you slept more than 3 hours last night. Tae-Yul reached out, his fingers hovering near the tray, almost touching the hem of her sleeve. For a fleeting second, the monster vanished, replaced by a man who was suddenly, terrifyingly aware of the person standing in front of him. And why do you care, Amara? Because, she said, turning to leave with a final, searching look that stripped away his armor. Everyone deserves to be seen. Even you, sir. The silence of the estate was shattered not by a sound, but by the heavy, metallic scent of iron. It was nearly 3 in the morning when the side entrance to the kitchen groaned open, admitting a shadow that moved with a jagged, uneven rhythm. Kwon Tae-Yul leaned heavily against the cold industrial refrigerator, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. His perfectly tailored black suit was torn at the shoulder, the silk dark and sodden with a wetness that looked like ink in the moonlight. He had managed to lose his security detail after the ambush, driving himself back in a state of primal adrenaline that was now rapidly evaporating, leaving behind a searing, white-hot agony. He didn't want the syndicate doctors. Their reports went straight to his father, and a wounded king was a king halfway to a grave. A light flickered on in the servants' corridor. Tae-Yul reached for the weapon at his small of his back, but his fingers slipped on his own blood. Sir, Amara stood at the end of the hall, wrapped in a simple cardigan over her nightgown. Her eyes widened, taking in the sight of the most powerful man in the city slumped against a sub-zero freezer, clutching a wound that was painting the white marble floor crimson. She didn't scream. She didn't run for the guards. Instead, she moved toward him with a focused, quiet urgency. Don't call anyone, Tae-Yul rasped, his head lolling back against the stainless steel. I'm not calling a soul, she whispered, stepping into his space and ducking under his good arm. She was smaller than him, but her strength was a revelation as she guided his dead weight toward the small, secluded staff bathroom behind the pantry. She sat him on the edge of the tub and began to work. Her hands were steady, even as she peeled back the ruined fabric of his shirt to reveal the jagged graze across his shoulder and the deeper puncture near his ribs. Tae-Yul hissed through his teeth, his vision blurring, but he found himself anchoring his gaze on her face. She looked neither disgusted nor terrified. She looked purposeful. From a small wooden box she kept in her locker, she pulled out jars that didn't belong in a modern first aid kit. She began mixing a pungent, earthy paste of crushed herbs and oils, remedies passed down from a grandmother who had known how to heal people the world ignored. This is going to sting, she warned, her voice a soft anchor in the rising tide of his pain. As she applied the mixture, Tae-Yul's hand shot out, gripping her wrist. His knuckles were white, his eyes wild with a sudden, flickering fever. Why are you helping me, Amara? I could have brought this war to your doorstep. Amara didn't pull away from his bruising grip. She met his gaze, her thumb moving in a slow, soothing circle against his pulse point. Because blood is just blood, sir. Whether it's on a marble floor or a dirt path, it all hurts the same. And right now, you aren't a boss. You're just a man who's hurting. The tension in his body broke. He released her, his hand falling limp as the herbal poultice began to draw the heat from his flesh. In the cramped, dimly lit room, the monster of Seoul watched a maid tend to his wounds with more care than his own father had ever shown him. For the first time, the blood on the marble didn't feel like a mark of power. It felt like a bridge. The following week, the atmosphere in the estate shifted from a freezing chill to something humbler, like the quiet before a different kind of storm. Tae-Yul's wound had begun to knit together under Amara's herbal poultices, but the curiosity she had planted in his mind was proving much harder to heal. He found himself in the private library long after the digital world had ceased its 99-message assault, waiting for the soft scuff of her shoes against the mahogany floor. When she finally entered, she didn't have a tea tray. Instead, she carried a small bucket of polish and a dusting cloth. She stopped when she saw him sitting in the dark, illuminated only by a single banker's lamp. "You should be resting, sir. Even monsters need sleep to stay sharp." Tae-Yul didn't look up from the heavy, leather-bound volume in his lap. "The shadows are louder at night, Amara. Sleep is just an opportunity for my enemies to catch up." He closed the book, the thud echoing in the cavernous room. "Tell me, why do you spend so much time in this corner of the house? There isn't even a window here to see your sunset." Amara stepped closer, her gaze drifting to the top shelf, where the books were layered in a fine coat of dust. "The books here are different. They aren't about law or history or family legacies. They're about color." She reached out, her fingers hovering near a slim, unlabeled portfolio tucked behind a set of encyclopedias. "And someone in this house has been hiding a very beautiful secret." Tae-Yul's posture went rigid, his hand instinctively tightening on the arm of his chair. "That's not for you to see." "I've already seen it, sir," she said softly, her voice devoid of judgment. "I saw the charcoal sketches of the Han River. I saw the oil studies of the Manhattan skyline at dawn, before the city wakes up to be angry." She looked at him then, her eyes wide and searching. "You don't want to be a boss. You want to be a creator." Tae-Yul let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for a decade. The confession felt like a physical weight leaving his chest. "In my family, an artist is a liability. A man who looks at the world for its beauty is a man who forgets to look for the knife in the dark. My father burned my canvases when I was 12. He told me that a Kwon only paints in one color, red. Red is the color of life, too," Amara countered, stepping into the circle of light cast by his lamp. She rested a hand lightly on the edge of the desk, close enough for him to feel the warmth of her presence. "My grandmother used to say that if you don't feed your soul, it starts to eat the rest of you. Is that why you're so cold, Tae-Yul? Because you're starving?" It was the first time she had used his name without the title. The sound of it, untethered from his rank, sent a jolt through him. He reached into the shadows of the shelf and pulled out a hidden sketchbook, flipping to a page where he had surreptitiously sketched her silhouette from memory. The lines were soft, capturing the quiet strength of her shoulders and the light in her natural hair. "I'm not starving anymore," he murmured, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying intensity. In the silence of the hidden library, the Mafia boss and the maid shared a truth that the 99 messages would never understand. Power was a prison, and art was the only key. The fragile peace of the library felt like a fever dream by the next afternoon. The golden dust motes that had danced between Tae-Yul and Amara were replaced by the harsh, fluorescent reality of the Syndicate's reach. Tae-Yul sat behind his obsidian desk, the 99 messages on his phone finally accompanied by a physical intrusion that he couldn't simply delete. Centered on the desk sat a box of lacquered rosewood, tied with a traditional gold silk cord. It was a gift from Elder Kwon, delivered by a courier who hadn't dared to make eye contact. Tae-Yul didn't need to open it to know what was inside, but the ritual demanded it. With a flick of his wrist, he cut the cord. Inside lay a formal marriage contract, the ink fresh and the names, Kwon Tae-Yul and Choi Hannah, embossed in a way that looked like a death warrant. Accompanying the papers was a single Polaroid photo. It wasn't of the bride-to-be. It was a grainy, long-distance shot of Amara standing by the estate's garden gate, her face turned toward the sun. There was a red ink circle drawn around her throat. The warning shot had been fired. The door opened softly, and the scent of Earl Grey preceded the woman herself. Amara entered with her usual quiet grace, but the moment she saw Tae-Yul's face, she stopped. The rigid, controlled mask he wore was back, tighter than ever. His eyes, which had softened in the library, were now two chips of black ice. "Sir?" she asked, her voice dipping with a concern that made his chest ache. "Get out, Amara," he said, his voice as flat as a guillotine blade. She didn't move. Her gaze fell to the desk, landing on the rosewood box and the discarded photo. He watched as the color drained from her face, her small hand flying to the apron over her chest. She wasn't a fool. She knew the language of his world. She understood that her presence had shifted from a secret comfort to a tactical liability. "He knows," she whispered, the word trembling in the air. Tae-Yul stood, his towering frame casting a long, jagged shadow over her. He wanted to reach out, to pull her behind the safety of his broad shoulders, but the photo reminded him that his touch was the very thing that marked her for the grave. "My father doesn't send gifts, he sends ultimatums. This contract is the price of your life. If I sign, you are invisible again. If I don't, you'll be a man who chose a maid over a kingdom." Amara finished for him, her voice regaining its strength even as her eyes filled with tears. She stepped closer, defying the coldness he was trying to project. "Is that why you're pushing me away? To save the girl in the picture?" Tae-Yul looked at the red circle around her neck, and then at the pulse beating frantically in her throat. The monster of Seoul felt the crushing weight of his crown. "I have ignored 1,000 threats to my life, Amara, but I cannot ignore this." He picked up the fountain pen, the gold nib hovering over the signature line that would bind him to a stranger and exile his soul forever. The room felt smaller, the luxury of the estate turning into a cage of his father's making. He looked at Amara, really looked at her, and realized that the 99 messages he had ignored were nothing compared to the one he was about to sign away. The pen remained suspended over the marriage contract, a drop of ink swelling at the tip like a dark, unshed tear. Tae-Yul looked at the document, then at the girl whose life was being bargained away by a man she had never met. Slowly, deliberately, he set the pen down on the rosewood box. He didn't sign it. Instead, he stood up and stripped off his tailored blazer, tossing it onto the obsidian desk as if discarding the weight of the Kwon Syndicate itself. "Sir," Amara whispered, her eyes tracking his movements with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Change out of your uniform," Tae-Yul commanded, though his voice had lost its jagged edge. "Put on something plain, something that doesn't belong to this house." 30 minutes later, the most feared man in Seoul stepped out of a service exit, unrecognizable in a simple black hoodie and worn denim. His slicked-back hair tousled forward to hide the sharp, familiar lines of his face. Beside him, Amara wore a borrowed sundress and a denim jacket, her curls free of the maid's headpiece. For the first time, they weren't boss and servant. They were just a man and a woman disappearing into the crowded, neon-lit veins of the city. They spent 3 hours in a world that didn't care about 99 ignored messages. They walked through a bustling street market in Myeongdong, the air thick with the scent of spicy rice cakes and sweet tteokbokki. Tae-Yul, who usually dined on Michelin-starred courses served in silence, found himself standing at a wooden stall, watching with a fascinated, boyish intensity as Amara laughed and fed him a piece of street food. The heat of the spice made him cough, and for a fleeting second, a genuine, unrestrained laugh broke through his icy composure. "You're human after all," she teased, wiping a smudge of sauce from the corner of his lip with her thumb. The touch was electric, anchoring him to the present moment more than any blood oath ever could. They wandered into an old arcade, the neon lights reflecting in Tae-Yul's dark eyes as he focused on a claw machine with the same lethal precision he used in gang negotiations. When he finally snagged a small, plush bear for her, he handed it over with a gravity that made her heart skip. In this stolen afternoon, the city wasn't a kingdom to be conquered, it was a playground. They sat on a park bench overlooking the river, sharing a single soda, their shoulders brushing. "I haven't felt the wind on my face like this since I was a child," Tae-Yul admitted, his gaze fixed on the water. "I forgot that the world exists outside of the screens and the shadows. It's always been here, Amara said, leaning her head tentatively against his shoulder. You just had to choose to see it. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in the same bruised purples of the Polaroid photo on his desk, the weight returned. Tae-Yul checked his watch. Their 3 hours of normal were over. He looked at Amara, her face glowing in the twilight, and knew that the afternoon wasn't just a stroll, it was a confession. He had tasted a life without the crown, and as they walked back toward the fortress of his estate, he realized he was no longer willing to live in the silence he had built. He wasn't just protecting a maid anymore. He was protecting the only version of himself he actually liked. The 3 hours of normalcy were a debt that the universe wasted no time in collecting. While Tae-Yul and Amara had been anonymous ghosts in the city's neon veins, the vacuum they left behind at the estate had been filled with a poisonous curiosity. Inside the gilded walls of the Kwon Manor, silence was never just empty space. It was a breeding ground for observation. Mrs. Han, the head housekeeper who had served the Kwon family for 30 years, stood in the shadows of the secondary service entrance. She had watched the young master discard his armor. She had seen him leave with the black maid, wearing clothes that made him look like a commoner, his eyes alight with a fire she hadn't seen since before the elder brother's funeral. To Mrs. Han, loyalty wasn't about love. It was about the preservation of the hierarchy that kept her own life stable. A maid who could move the ghost boss was a threat to the natural order. By the time Tae-Yul and Amara returned, the betrayal had already traveled through the encrypted channels of the syndicate. The air inside the estate felt different, colder, sharper, like a blade pulled from a sheath. Tae-Yul felt it the moment he stepped into the foyer. His internal sensors, honed by years of surviving ambushes, screamed of a presence that didn't belong. He looked at Amara, whose face was still flushed from the evening wind, her hand still clutching the small plush bear from the arcade. A wave of protective dread washed over him. "Go to your quarters, Amara. Now," he whispered, his voice returning to the low, lethal rasp of the syndicate head. "Tae-Yul, what's wrong?" she asked, the transition from his name back to the reality of their roles jarring her. "Do not use my name," he snapped, the cruelty in his tone a desperate attempt to distance her from the target on his back. "Just go." He watched her retreat, her confusion morphing into a quiet, hurt dignity. As soon as her footsteps faded, a door at the end of the long gallery opened. Out stepped Owen, Tae-Yul's right-hand man, but he wasn't alone. Behind him were two of the elder's personal enforcers, men who handled cleaning duties that were too sensitive for the standard ranks. "Sir," Owen said, his voice thick with regret. He held up a tablet showing a grainy image taken just an hour ago. Tae-Yul and Amara sharing a soda by the river. The elder received this 15 minutes ago. Mrs. Han felt it was her duty to report a lapse in security. Tae-Yul's hand went to his neck, his thumb tracing the dragon tattoo as if to steady the rage vibrating through his frame. "Mrs. Han is a ghost. Ensure she is gone by dawn." "That isn't the problem, sir," Owen replied, stepping forward. "The elder has declared the girl a malignancy. He believes she is the reason you haven't signed the Kim contract. He's authorized a removal. Not an exile, sir. A removal." The word hung in the air like a noose. Tae-Yul looked at the stairs leading to the staff quarters. The 99 messages on his phone began to chime again, a frantic chorus of his world demanding he return to his cold, blood-stained throne. But all he could see was the red circle from the Polaroid, now closing in on the woman who had dared to see him as a man. The informant had turned his sanctuary into a hunting ground, and for the first time in his life, Kwon Tae-Yul knew that to save her, he would have to become the very monster she claimed he wasn't. The transition from the estate to the underworld was instantaneous, a violent pivot that stripped the last of the humanity from Tae-Yul's gaze. He hadn't even reached Amara's door when the silence of the hallway was broken by the heavy thud of a struggle and the screech of tires echoing from the service courtyard below. By the time he reached the window, a nondescript black van was tearing through the gates, leaving behind only the smell of burnt rubber and the small, plush bear from the arcade lying abandoned on the gravel. It wasn't his father's cleanup crew. The van bore the plates of the Shin clan, vultures who had been circling the Kwon Syndicate for months. They didn't want to kill Amara. They wanted to use her to break the man who ignored 99 messages. They had realized that the ghost boss finally had a pulse, and they intended to cut it. "Assemble the units," Tae-Yul commanded, his voice vibrating with a frequency that made Owen step back. "Every soldier, every informant. I want the city sealed." "Sir, the Elder." "The Elder is irrelevant," Tae-Yul hissed, grabbing his blazer and a weapon. "If a single hair on her head is harmed, I will burn every dock, every warehouse, and every bridge in this city until there is nowhere left for them to hide. I am not the heir tonight. I am the end." For the next 4 hours, Seoul witnessed the true meaning of a syndicate's wrath. Tae-Yul didn't lead from a desk. He led from the front, a dark blur of precision and rage. He moved through the city like a localized storm, kicking down doors of known Shin fronts, his knuckles bruised, and his dragon tattoo slick with a mixture of rain and sweat. He ignored his phone as it exploded with 150, 200, 300 messages, calls from his father screaming about the breach of protocol, texts from rivals threatening total war. He silenced them all. The only message that mattered was the one he was sending with every strike: "She is mine." He finally found the trail in a derelict shipyard on the edge of the Han River. The air was thick with the scent of salt and rust. Inside a hollowed-out warehouse, he saw her. Amara was tied to a chair in the center of a salt-water-stained floor, her denim jacket torn, but her head held high. A mid-level Shin lieutenant stood over her, a blade glinting in the moonlight as he prepared to film a ransom video. Tae-Yul didn't wait for a tactical opening. He stepped into the light, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the industrial landscape. He didn't look like a businessman or a boss. He looked like the monster the world had spent years crafting. "Step away from her," Tae-Yul said, the words falling like heavy stones into the silence. The lieutenant laughed, pressing the blade closer to Amara's throat. "One more step, and the maid dies, Kwon." Amara's eyes found Tae-Yul's. In that look, there was no terror, only a heartbreaking, steady trust. She didn't call for help. She didn't scream. She simply breathed his name, a soft "sir" that cut through the darkness more effectively than any bullet. Tae-Yul's grip on his weapon tightened. The city behind him was already in flames, a testament to how far he was willing to go. He had burned his legacy to find her, and as he prepared to finish the night, he knew there was no going back to the man who lived in the silence. He was ready to burn the rest of the world just to keep her warm. The warehouse erupted into a symphony of calculated violence. Tae-Yul moved with a terrifying, fluid grace that made the Shin soldiers look like amateurs. He was no longer the man who hid behind a mahogany desk. He was a force of nature, driven by a singular, desperate focus. He didn't use a silencer. The thunderous cracks of his weapon echoed against the corrugated metal walls, a roar of defiance against the world that thought it could take her from him. When the last of the Shin guards fell, the silence that followed was heavy with the smell of ozone and spent brass. Tae-Yul dropped his weapon and crossed the salt-stained floor in 3 long strides. His hands, usually so steady and cold, trembled as he reached for the ropes binding Amara to the chair. He sliced through the restraints with a flick of a tactical knife, his eyes scanning her for any sign of a permanent mark. "I've got you," he breathed, his voice breaking in a way that would have shocked his father's board of directors. "Amara, I've got you." As the ropes fell away, she didn't collapse. She lunged forward, her arms wrapping around his neck with a strength that nearly knocked him back. She buried her face in the crook of his shoulder, her natural curls tickling his jaw, and for a moment, the shipyard and the war outside ceased to exist. Tae-Yul pulled her into his chest, his large hands shielding the back of her head, holding her as if she were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. "You came," she whispered against his skin. "I knew you would, but you shouldn't have risked everything." Tae-Yul pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. His face was streaked with soot, and the dragon tattoo on his neck was damp with sweat, but his gaze was clearer than it had been in 8 years. He looked at her, not as a maid, not as a liability, but as the woman who had brought light into a room he had intentionally left dark. "There is no everything without you," he confessed. The weight of the 99 messages, the pressure of the Kim family alliance, and the blood-soaked legacy of the Kwon name felt like a skin he was finally shedding. He realized in the echoing quiet of that warehouse that he had reached his breaking point. He could no longer be the ghost boss who lived in a fortress of silence. He couldn't go back to the marble tables and the cold, digital demands of a life he never chose. He had burned the city to find her, and in the process, he had burned the man he used to be. The transition was absolute. He wasn't just rescuing a maid, he was choosing a side. He looked at Amara, seeing the person who had called him sir, and seen the man beneath the title, and he knew that the empire his father had built was nothing compared to the peace she offered. "I'm done being a weapon, Amara," he murmured, pressing his forehead against hers. "From now on, I only answer to you." Outside, the sirens of his own syndicate approached, but Tae-Yul didn't move. He stayed there, holding her in the ruins of the shipyard, finally understanding that true power wasn't the ability to ignore the world. It was the courage to stay for the person who made it worth living in. The return to the Kwon estate was not a homecoming. It was an invasion. Tae-Yul marched through the grand foyer, his hand locked firmly in Amara's. He didn't stop to check the 99 messages screaming for his attention on the monitors in the hallway. He didn't pause to acknowledge the guards who stood frozen, caught between their fear of the son and their loyalty to the father. He headed straight for the great hall, where the air was thick with the scent of incense and old, rotting tradition. Elder Kwon sat at the head of the long mahogany table, the marriage contract with the Kim family spread out before him like a death warrant. He didn't look up as the door swung open. "You burned 3 warehouses and crippled our standing with the Shin clan for a servant," the old man said, his voice a dry, papery rasp. "You have proven the Kim girl is a necessity. You are weak, Tae-Yul. You have let a momentary itch compromise a century of blood." "I haven't compromised anything," Tae-Yul replied, his voice echoing with a terrifying, newfound clarity. He stepped forward, pulling Amara into the light of the chandelier. "I've simply decided what is worth protecting, and it isn't your pride." The elder finally looked up, his eyes narrowing into slits of cold venom. "You will sign the contract, or you will watch her die in this room. There are no other options for a Kwon." Tae-Yul felt Amara's hand tremble in his, but she didn't pull away. He looked at her, seeing the woman who had healed his wounds with herbs and his soul with a single word. Then, he looked at his father. Slowly, Tae-Yul reached into his blazer and pulled out his encrypted phone, the device that held the keys to the syndicate's wealth, its secrets, and its loyalty. "You speak of tradition," Tae-Yul said, his voice dropping to a lethal, velvet register. "But tradition is just the ghost of dead men. The captains, the enforcers, the banks, they don't answer to a ghost anymore. They answer to the man who leads them into the fire." He tossed the phone onto the table. It slid across the wood, stopping inches from the elder's hand. "I've already sent the message. Every account has been moved. Every loyalist has been reassigned. You aren't the chairman anymore, father. You're just an old man in a very large, very empty house." The elder reached for the phone, his fingers shaking with rage, but the screen flickered with a new notification: access denied. "You would betray your own blood for her," the elder hissed, his face contorting. "I am saving my blood," Tae-Yul corrected him. He stepped closer, his shadow swallowing his father's frail frame. "From becoming like yours." He turned to the guards standing in the shadows, men who had watched him burn the city to save one woman. "The elder is retiring to the country estate. See that he is comfortable. See that he is silent." The guards bowed, not to the old man, but to the new king. Tae-Yul turned back to Amara. The mask of the Mafia boss didn't just crack, it fell away entirely. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that defied every rule of his world. "It's over," he whispered. "The empire is mine, but I am yours." In the heart of the fortress built on blood and silence, Kwon Tae-Yul finally answered the only call that mattered. He didn't need 99 messages to know he was home. 6 months had passed since the great hall fell silent, and the Kwon estate no longer felt like a mausoleum of cold marble and buried secrets. The heavy, dark drapes that had once shielded Tae-Yul from the world were gone, replaced by sheer linen that allowed the morning sun to spill across the floors. The scent of medicinal herbs and old tobacco had been permanently evicted by the fragrance of fresh jasmine and the earthy, vibrant aroma of oil paints. Kwon Tae-Yul stood in the center of the redesigned library, which had been transformed into a sun-drenched studio. He was no longer wearing the rigid, three-piece armor of a Mafia prince. Instead, he wore a simple white linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up, exposing the dragon tattoo on his forearm, a mark that now symbolized the protection of a sanctuary rather than the herald of a war. Before him stood a canvas, thick with the textures of a life finally being lived. It wasn't painted in the red his father had demanded. It was a symphony of golds, deep browns, and the warm, glowing bronze of a woman's skin. The quiet of the house was interrupted not by a scream or a report of violence, but by the light, rhythmic sound of footsteps he had learned to distinguish from 1,000 others. Amara entered the room, but the gray uniform and white apron were gone, relegated to a past that felt like a lifetime ago. She wore a vibrant, emerald green silk dress that flowed around her like water, her natural curls adorned with a small, gold clip he had given her on their first official anniversary. She didn't carry a tray. She carried herself with the quiet, unshakable dignity of a woman who was no longer a shadow in the halls, but the heart of the home. Tae-Yul's phone, resting on a nearby stool, began to vibrate. It was a familiar rhythm, the 100th message of the day. For a moment, his jaw tightened by habit, the old instinct to ignore the world rising within him. He glanced at the screen, an urgent update from Owen regarding the Syndicate's transition into legitimate tech ventures. But as Amara walked toward him, the digital noise faded into insignificance. Tae-Yul picked up the device, but he didn't check the messages. With a decisive swipe, he powered it down, the blue light vanishing into the sunlight. "Still ignoring the world, sir?" Amara teased, coming to stand beside him. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her presence a grounding force that made the empire outside feel small. Tae-Yul turned, his hands, stained with the colors of his choosing, reaching out to cup her face. He looked at her with an intensity that suggested he was memorizing her all over again. "The world has nothing left to tell me that I haven't already found here," he whispered. He picked up the phone one last time, not to answer a partner or a rival, but to dial the only number saved in his favorites. As the call connected, Amara's own phone chimed in her hand. She looked down and laughed, a bright, soulful sound that filled the room. The message was simple, echoing the very first word that had bridged their two worlds. "I love you, sir." "You're late with your response," she whispered, leaning in to close the distance between them. "I'm exactly on time," Tae-Yul replied, pulling her into a kiss that tasted of freedom and forever. In the house of Kwon, the silence was finally broken, not by the demands of a crown, but by the soft, enduring heartbeat of a love that had defied an empire.